Friends, I hope you are all well. Today I have come to your service with a new audiobook about the great mujahid of the Islamic world, the conqueror of Bait al-Muqaddas, Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi. Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi, who at the time of his death was the ruler and owner of the regions of Sham, Palestine, Egypt and countless other fertile and populous areas. When he passed away, only 1 dinar and 40 dirhams were found on him. Apart from this, he had no wealth, property, cash or goods of any kind. This was because he would spend everything he received in the path of Allah and lived his life relying on Allah. Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi was a perfect example of an ideal life for Muslims. He was a great sultan of the Muslims and an unparalleled son of the Islamic world. When he became sultan, a Christian ruler named Reginald ruled over an area called Karak, which lay on the route between Sham and Egypt. This ruler of Karak, Reginald, was notorious for his treacherous activities. He took great pleasure in looting peaceful caravans or pilgrims traveling from Sham to Egypt or from Sham to Makkah and Medina. In 1179, during a period of truce, a Muslim caravan passed near his fortress and camped peacefully in a large nearby field, trusting the peace treaty. This treacherous Christian ruler captured every man, woman, and animal of that caravan and seized goods worth 200,000 Tyrian dinars. In those days, the Christian ruler of Bait al-Muqaddas, Jerusalem, was Baldwin. He protested against the ruler of Karak and sent a representative to demand the return of the Muslims, seize goods and the release of the Muslim prisoners, but he refused to listen to the royal messenger from Bait al-Muqaddas. Then, in 1183, he committed a similar act. During peacetime, he dared to attack Medina with an army. After that, a third incident occurred in 1186 when peace had been established between Muslims and Christians, and caravans were traveling between Sham and Egypt. This ruler of Karak, Reginald, suddenly pounced on a group of Muslim pilgrims and looted a great deal of their belongings. It is said that in that caravan, a sister of the Muslim sultan was also traveling. When the caravan people protested to Reginald, he mockingly replied, referring to the Christian monks of old, and said, "Because you believe in Muhammad, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, so call him to come and save you." When the news of his insolent remarks and the 3 instances of harming Muslims reached the Sultan, he swore that he would kill this treacherous and oppressive Christian ruler with his own hands. And that great son of the Islamic world, that great Sultan, fulfilled his oath. The great, brave, and incomparable Muhammad Salahuddin Ayyubi was that Sultan. This Sultan, who felt the pain of the Muslim Ummah and its people when he became the Sultan of the Muslims after Sultan Nuruddin Zengi. At that time, Europeans, Christians, and Crusaders had forcibly occupied most of Palestine. In those days, Muslims had small states that could not maintain their unity. Taking advantage of this disunity, local Christians and Crusaders from Europe had captured Muslim areas. After this forcible occupation, first, Sultan Nuruddin Zengi's father, Salahuddin Zengi, tried to reclaim his areas and was successful to some extent. After him, Nuruddin Zengi himself fought many wars against the Christians and reclaimed some territories. But most of Palestine was still under Christian control, and the largest and holiest city, Bait al-Muqaddas, was in their possession. After Nuruddin Zengi, when finally Salahuddin Ayyubi became Sultan, he resolved that he would undoubtedly reclaim the Muslim areas that the Christians had taken. Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi was born in 530 Tikrit AD in the city of Tikrit. His fame began when, during the reign of Sultan Nuruddin Zengi, his uncle Shirko took him along on a campaign to Egypt, which both the uncle and nephew successfully accomplished. After that, Salahuddin Ayyubi's uncle, Shirko, took him on another campaign to Egypt. There both the uncle and nephew were successful. Shirko was appointed the vizier of Egypt. When he passed away, the great sultan of the Muslims, Nuruddin Zengi, appointed Salahuddin Ayyubi as the vizier there, and he proved his excellent administrative capabilities. After Sultan Nuruddin Zengi, Salahuddin became the sultan of those areas. His full name was Yusuf bin Najmuddin Ayyub, because during Sultan Nuruddin Zangi's time, Salahuddin had carried out excellent and unparalleled services, for which Sultan Nuruddin Zangi had given him the title of Al-Malik al-Nasir. After becoming Sultan, Salahuddin first pounced like a hawk on the Christian areas of Gara and Kelen. These were Muslim areas that the Christians had snatched. The Christian garrisons there were crushed by Salahuddin Ayyubi. Seeing this situation, the Christian king of Beit al-Muqaddas, Baldwin, made a peace treaty with Sultan Salahuddin for 2 years. During that period, Sultan Salahuddin, while improving his internal affairs, continued to increase his army. Since in the past, European Christians had invaded Palestine, taking advantage of Muslim disunity, they had captured vast Muslim areas and had named those wars the Crusades. Before Sultan Salahuddin, in the Crusades that had already occurred, many Muslim areas had fallen under Christian control. When Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi began striking the enemy and reclaiming his territories, Turks and Kurds from Egypt, the Hijaz, Arabia, Mosul, Sinjar, Al-Jazeera, Rabi, and Haran began joining his army in droves, so that the areas that Europeans had taken from Muslims due to their disunity could be reclaimed. While Sultan Salahuddin was setting his internal affairs in order and also preparing his army as he wished, Guy of Lusignan was the king of Jerusalem, Beit al-Muqaddas. He was a relative of the ruler of Iraq, Reginald, whom the Sultan had previously sworn to kill with his own hands. After completing his preparations, the Sultan moved with his army. In the area of the Dead Sea, he assembled his army at a place called Ashtara, which consisted of about 12,000 cavalry, and the number of people who had joined the army voluntarily was also substantial. During his stay there, the Sultan consulted his commanders. He divided the army into 5 parts: Maymanas right wing, Maysara left wing, Kaaba center, Alkanj rear, and Muqaddamatu al-Jaysh vanguard, and appointed excellent commanders of his choice over them. Meanwhile, when the Crusaders, Christians, received news that the Sultan had completed his preparations, all their rulers gathered to confront Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi. The Sultan had chosen Friday to initiate battle against the enemy. He chose Friday so that the prayers of the common people could become a means of intercession for him in the court of Allah. During his stay in Ashtara, Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi sent his informers and spies towards the enemy territories to keep him informed of the enemy's movements. His informers informed the Sultan that a very large Crusader army was camped at a place called Safuria, and its number was several times greater than that of Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi's army. After receiving this information, the Sultan himself intended to march with his army and confront the enemy. In this regard, the Sultan consulted all his commanders, and they agreed with the Sultan's proposal to advance and face the enemy. They should strike them such a blow that compensation is made for the loss they inflicted upon Muslims in the past. The Sultan, acting upon the advice of his commanders, marched with the army and led his forces from the Palestinian city of Tiberias towards miles of Kafar Sat, 6 miles to the southwest. From that hill, the Sultan and his soldiers could clearly see the road that led from Safuria to Beit al-Muqaddas. It was on this road that the Christians were to advance to attack the Sultan. When Sultan Salahuddin saw that the Christians were moving slowly from Safuria and would take several days to reach him, he did not let his army sit idle, because the Sultan himself did not want to remain idle. Nearby was the Christian city of Tiberias, which had once belonged to the Muslims but was forcibly captured by the Christians. The Sultan with his army, at Tiberias like an unstoppable storm. The Christian army inside Tiberias tried to resist, but within moments, Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi annihilated it, and after capturing the city, hoisted his flag on the fortress. When the news reached King Guy of Lusignan and his allied rulers and commanders that Sultan Salahuddin had suddenly attacked and captured the city of Tiberias, and had killed the army stationed there, They greatly increased their pace towards Salahuddin. The Sultan's informers were also keeping him informed of the enemy's every move. Then one day from the hill where the Sultan was camped, he saw the advance guard of the Crusader army advancing. Therefore, the Sultan made final preparations to face the enemy. When the enemy arrived, the Sultan broke camp from where he was and camped on the plateau of Masyaf near a town called Tian, 3 miles to the east. Tian was surrounded by olive groves. In that area, a spring of sweet, clear water flowed towards the northwest, and south of this town was a hill that has been named in history as the Horns of Hattin, where the decisive battle between Sultan Salahuddin and the Christians was to take place. This hill of Hattin is situated at an elevation of 600 feet above the plain and 100 feet below it to the west. A plain is clearly visible. From here, one road goes towards the Palestinian city of Acre, and another goes towards Beit al-Muqaddas. Standing on the top of Jabal Hattin, if one looks west, they see scorched plains with sand dunes and some bushes scattered here and there. It was through this plain that the Crusader army had to pass to reach Sultan Salahuddin. Below this hill, at 1,700 feet, was a lake of clear, transparent water which was called Lake Galilee. North of this lake was the famous snow-covered mountain range of Wadi al-Ardin known as Jabal Harman. To the east was Jabal Jalala, which stretched continuously towards Damascus. When the Christians learned of the place where Sultan Salahuddin had camped with his army, they mocked and made fun of the Sultan, thinking that the place where the Muslim Sultan had camped with his army had Lake Tiberias behind it. The Christians thought that when they would attack Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi forcefully, they would push them back towards the slopes that led to the lake and drown them in it. On Friday, July 3, the Crusader army reached that valley, which was in the form of barren plains with sand dunes and dry bushes here and there. Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi was closely watching the enemy. When the Crusader army reached that semi-desert area, doom befell them because Sultan Salahuddin appeared with his army like a raiding lion. With great force, first the Sultan raised the takbir, Allahu Akbar, and then his army raised the takbir in such a way that the entire atmosphere resonated with the chants of Allahu Akbar. After that, the Sultan attacked the enemy and crushed a part of the enemy army. Although the army with Guy of Lusignan was several times larger than Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi's army, Guy's army included seasoned and expert warriors from Europe. There were also famous Christian fighters, but they could do nothing against the Sultan. The Sultan had utterly dismantled the Crusader army in this desert area. The Sultan's attacks were so intense that the Christians, trying to counter the Sultan, grew tired. Finally, when the sun set, King Guy ordered his army to camp there because his soldiers were tired and were no longer capable of facing the Muslims. That night was a night of doom for the Crusader army. It was the peak of summer. The Christians were in a bad state due to the heat. On the other hand, the Sultan and his soldiers were accustomed to this heat. To further harass the enemy, the Sultan employed another strategy at night. He set fire to the dry bushes and grass surrounding the Crusader army. Now the heat intensified further. It seemed as if nature was supporting Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi, and Allah was sinking the Christians into the swamp of disgrace and regret. Finally, the night passed in some way, and the sun rose. The next day, the Sultan gave final shape to his war preparations to strike the enemy. Between Jabal Hattin, there was an open field surrounded by mountain ranges. On these mountain ranges, the Sultan stationed his soldiers and equipped them with arrows. Every rider's quiver was filled with arrows. It is said that on the mountain ranges, the Sultan had 70 camels laden with arrows stationed nearby, so that arrows could be immediately provided to the soldiers when needed. Besides those camels, approximately 400 additional arrow bundles were placed there. Thus, for the next day's battle with the enemy, the Sultan's army was ready and prepared. The next day, King Guy of the Christians attempted to move with his army towards Lake Tiberias to refresh themselves with the lake water, and then confront the Muslims properly. But near the lake, at a place called Lubia, the Sultan's army blocked his way and attacked so forcefully that they were forced to retreat. Then the Christians tried towards another side, where there were springs with usable water. But from that side as well, the Sultan's soldiers rained such arrows, and some warriors attacked in such a manner that they were repelled from there as well. Sultan Salahuddin and his soldiers had now brought the enemy into the fields surrounded by the mountain ranges, and when the Crusader army reached that field, from all sides, Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi's army began attacking, raising the chance of takbir. Hand-to-hand combat began between the two armies. Although Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi was facing a much larger force, since against him were the King of Jerusalem and many other rulers from Ars Palestine and many other leaders. Besides, the Templars and Hospitallers from Europe were also participating in the war with full fervor. The Templars were those who were professional archers and swordsmen, who had participated with great enthusiasm in the Crusades, with Muslims in the 11th and 12th centuries. They were also called soldiers of the church or assassins. As for the Hospitallers, initially, these people were established in various countries to care for and look after the sick in hospitals. They had an institution in Jerusalem. Later, when the Crusades between Europeans and Muslims began, they took the fording community from a religious institution. In this war, King Raymond of Antioch, who was also Guy's brother-in-law, was participating with his large army to help King Guy of Jerusalem, and was inciting and fighting his soldiers against Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi with great fervor. In the war, Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi was visible everywhere in his army. He himself was striking the enemy on every front while also boosting the morale of his army, encouraging them. Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi's fighting style was unique. He was using Arab tactics, striking the enemy by giving hope and cutting them down piece by piece. At the time when the fierce battle was at its peak, Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi was fighting the enemy amidst his army, boosting their morale. In contrast, the king of Beit al-Muqaddas, Guy of Lusignan, was sitting in his tent on top of a mountain range, watching the battle, and in front of his tent, a wooden cross had been erected, which the Christians believed was the cross on which Jesus Christ, peace be upon him, was crucified. The Hospitallers and Templars of Europe considered themselves very brave, courageous, and masters of the sword, thinking of themselves as incomparable. But here, against Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi, all their skills were proving useless. Muslim soldiers were attacking and driving them, like a lively shepherd herds a flock of helpless sheep and goats. When the enemy leaders saw that they were close to defeat at the hands of Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi, they attempted one last effort because even then, their army's number was several times larger than the Sultan's. They launched a sudden attack on the Sultan's army. Here the Sultan employed an excellent military tactic. He opened his ranks, moved aside, and when the enemy came between them, the Sultan's army attacked from both sides such that most were sent to their deaths. Now it was afternoon. Muslims were accustomed to bearing the heat. Another thing was done. The bushes and dry grass in the battlefield were set on fire. On one hand, the blazing sun from above was heating the atmosphere, and on the other, the burning grass and bushes were making the ground hot. Due to the swift and deadly attacks of Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi, chaos and confusion had now erupted in the enemy's front lines as well. When the enemy's front lines began to flee and move back, signs of cowardice and demoralization also began to appear in the rear of the army. Now the situation was such that Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi's soldiers had surrounded the army several times their size and began massacring them in the fields surrounded by mountain ranges. Finally, the Christians faced a worse defeat at the hands of Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi. Raymond, the king of Antioch who came to help the king of Jerusalem, fled after his defeat with his remaining army. Similarly, Other major commanders also fled, seeing their defeat. Now the situation was that the Sultan's soldiers were entering the enemy's camp and annihilating them. And the misfortune of the enemy army was that Muslim soldiers also attacked the tent and the cross on the mountain where their king, Guy of Lusignan's tent was, and where the sacred cross was erected, which the Christians considered holy and believed that Jesus Christ, peace be upon him, was killed on it. The king of Jerusalem was captured, and the cross in front of his tent was also captured. Now in the battlefield, every single Muslim soldier was herding 30 Christians, tied with ropes, dragging them along. The battlefield was piled with heaps of Christian corpses. Everywhere, broken crosses and severed limbs were scattered far and wide. Finally, the Christians were defeated, and Sultan Saladin achieved a complete victory. The Sultan's tent was pitched in the victorious battlefield, and the command was given to present the great commanders and prisoners before him. First, the king of Jerusalem, Guy of his brother, Reginald, the ruler of Kerak, were presented before the Sultan. The Sultan ordered the king of Jerusalem to sit near him and gave him cold water to drink because he was feeling thirsty. Guy drank a little water and gave the remaining water to his brother, Reginald, the ruler of Kerak, who was standing nearby. But at that moment, suddenly the Sultan stood up from his place and placed his sword between the two so that Reginald could not take the glass. Then the Sultan, addressing the king of Jerusalem, began to say, "Among us, the one who is given water and bread is considered safe. But this person is a representative of Satan. I swore twice to kill him. Once when he looted the caravan of pilgrims, and the second time when he was daring to attack the holy places." Actually, Reginald was the ruler of Kerak who wanted to attack Mecca and Medina. For this, he built new ships to attack Mecca and Medina via the Red Sea, but fortunately, the Muslims got the news in time and Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi ordered his Emir naval commander to attack Reginald. The Emir Bar's name was Lulu, and he attacked with such loyalty and bravery that he killed Reginald's army, and Reginald barely escaped with his life and fled towards Kerak. Anyway, the Sultan did not let Reginald drink water, and addressing him said, "O representative of Satan, I swore to kill you twice. At this time you have come to my tent with your brother, but you cannot escape from me. You will not be allowed to drink water." And with that, the Sultan, in a state of great anger, waved his sword and advanced towards Reginald, and finished him with a single blow. Then one of the Sultan's soldiers came into the tent and dragged Reginald's body outside. The king of Jerusalem trembled upon seeing this spectacle. He thought that after killing his brother, he too would be put to death. But the Sultan addressed him and said, "It is not the way of kings to kill kings." After that, the Sultan sent the king of Jerusalem and along with him the countless great commanders and leaders who had come to participate in the war with great enthusiasm and were captured to the prison of Damascus. It is said that in this war, approximately 30,000 Christians were killed at the hands of Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi on the battlefield, and a year later, heaps of their bones were still visible in the field. It was a glorious victory for Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi against the Christian forces. After the worst defeat of the Christian fields of Tayan, and the glorious victory of Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi, a man named Balian escaped from the battlefield of Hattin. He was a very great leader of the Christians. When he escaped from the war of Tayan, he sent a messenger to the service of Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi, and requested that he be permitted to enter Jerusalem, so that he could see his children who are in Jerusalem, Beit al-Muqaddas, and take them to a safe place. Since he had to pass near the Sultan's army to go towards Jerusalem, he sought this permission from the Sultan. The Sultan, with great magnanimity, permitted Balian and also set the condition that he would stay in Beit al-Muqaddas for only 1 day, after which he would leave there with his family. Balian accepted it. Balian also promised the Sultan that after taking his family out of Jerusalem, he would never participate in war against the Sultan. But Balian could not abide by this promise. His misfortune was that when he entered Jerusalem, there was no commander or leader present there at that time, because in the Battle of Hattin, not only the king of Jerusalem but also countless commanders and leaders with him had been captured by Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi and sent to Damascus. Therefore, when Balian entered Beit al-Muqaddas, he was given a grand reception. The people wanted to make him the king of Beit al-Muqaddas, but he refused the people. After that, the treasures of the churches in Beit al-Muqaddas and its surroundings, where wealth was accumulated, were opened by the Christian leaders, and they began recruiting soldiers. Thus, inside the city, approximately 60,000 men were ready to face Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi. On the other hand, Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi, after badly defeating the enemy in the field of Hattin, did not waste time and captured the city of Tiberias. 4 days later, with great speed and lightning speed, he headed towards the coastal city of Acre. The city of Acre had been taken from the Muslims by European Christians 90 years ago. Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi pounced on the city like a hawk. The Christian army inside the city could not withstand the Sultan's attacks. Therefore, the Muslims captured the city of Acre. The Sultan prayed in the Mosque of Acre, which the Christians had captured 90 years ago and converted into their church. After conquering the city of Acre, the Sultan divided his army into different parts and sent them to conquer various cities of Palestine that were under Christian control at that time. One army advanced and captured Sophia and Arsuf. Another army conquered the coastal cities of Haifa and Caesarea. A third army conquered Sabda and Nawal. During this time, the Sultan summoned his brother, Al-Adil from Egypt. The Sultan's younger brother, Saifuddin al-Adil, was the governor of Egypt on behalf of the Sultan. The Sultan had called him to himself so that both brothers together could the Holy Land of Palestine from the Christians. Upon receiving his brother's order, the younger brother, Saifuddin al-Adil, departed from Cairo with great speed towards Palestine. On his way, 2 Christian forts, Marajil and Jaffa, lay. Saifuddin al-Adil attacked both forts with such enthusiasm, spirit and strength that without wasting time he captured them. Then he advanced rapidly towards Palestine. On the other hand, Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi's condition was such that, like his other commanders, he set out with his share of the army from Acre. First, he conquered the city of Raymond, then he advanced towards the coast. First, he conquered the city of Sarafa, and then within a week, Sultan Salahuddin captured large cities like Sedan, Beirut, and Jubail, forcing them to surrender, and crushed the Christian armies that resisted him inside those cities. Now, besides the 2 strongholds of the Templars and Hospitallers, 2 large cities on the coast remained for Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi to capture. After conquering various cities, the Sultan attacked the city of Ascalon. There was a very large army inside the city. The Sultan besieged the city. The Christians inside put up a strong resistance. The Sultan's way of waging war was that he usually began the attack on a city or fortress on a Friday. Therefore, Ascalon was also conquered by Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi on a Friday. The conquest of Ascalon was a very great success for Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi against the Christians. On that occasion, Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi showed great magnanimity and generosity. He freed the former king of Beit al-Muqaddas, Guy, and along with him, his commanders and leaders who had been captured and imprisoned in the prisons of Damascus. At the time when, after conquering Ascalon, the Sultan was camped there with his army, a delegation of Christians from Beit al-Muqaddas arrived in the service of Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi. They wanted to negotiate peace with the Sultan. It is said that on that occasion, a solar eclipse occurred, and the Christians considered it ominous for themselves. This delegation from Beit al-Muqaddas that came to the Sultan and wanted to discuss peace, their purpose was that the Sultan should not conquer Beit al-Muqaddas and leave it under Christian control. The Sultan, addressing the delegation, said, "For my predecessors, I permit the inhabitants of Beit al-Muqaddas to fortify and strengthen the city as they wish and cultivate the land within a radius of 15 miles around it, until the coming Fridays. If they feel that they can defend the city against me, can face me if I attack, then let them remain in possession of Beit al-Muqaddas. If I have the courage, I will conquer the city. But if they do not have hope of help from any side, and they feel that if I attack the city they cannot face me, then they should surrender the city to me peacefully without fighting. I promise you that I will protect all the inhabitants of Beit al-Muqaddas and their wealth and belongings in the best manner. This was an excellent offer from Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi to the Christians of Beit al-Muqaddas, and compared to the Christians' disgraceful breach of promise and treaty breaking, the Sultan's attitude was extremely noble and magnanimous. But unfortunately, the delegation from Beit al-Muqaddas, without thinking, rejected Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi's proposal, and in response, they said, "If God wills, we will never hand over this city to the Muslims because in this city, our Savior, Jesus Christ, peace be upon him, gave his life for us." It is said that upon hearing this, the Sultan was pleased with their faith, but he swore before them that he would conquer Beit al-Muqaddas without harming its honor and respect, using the sword. The Sultan's magnanimity is also commendable because a few days earlier, the people of Jerusalem had set an example of treaty breaking when Balian went to them after promising the Sultan for only one night. But the people of Beit al-Muqaddas forced him to break his promise and appointed him as the ruler there. But despite all this, the Sultan tolerated their treaty breaking, and he treated the delegation with kindness, showing the character of the people. Also, he gave them time until Fridays so that if they wanted to call for help for the city's defense, they could call. If they wanted to contact someone, they could do so. After that, the Sultan would attack the city. When the period of time that Sultan Salahuddin had given to the Christians of Beit al-Muqaddas ended, the Sultan moved with his army and headed towards Beit al-Muqaddas. It is said that in just a short period of 75 days, Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi had taken all the major cities of Palestine from the Christians. Only Beit al-Muqaddas remained, which was the capital of the Christians in Palestine. This city was the common object of aspiration between Christians and Muslims. The Sultan with his army camped in front of Beit al-Muqaddas. Inside the city, Christians had gathered to such an extent for the defense of Beit al-Muqaddas that there was no room for people to stay in houses and streets. After camping, when the Sultan surveyed the wall, he estimated that he had camped in the wrong place with his army, because from where the Sultan had camped, arrows shot from the wall could reach, which could harm the Sultan's soldiers. Besides, if the Sultan attacked the city during the day, the sun would be in front, which could cause difficulty for the Sultan's soldiers. Therefore, the Sultan began to survey other areas to move the camp from there. After 5 days of survey, the Sultan moved the camp from there and advanced towards the east. When the city dwellers saw that the Sultan had moved the camp and had withdrawn towards the east, they thought that the Sultan did not want to attack Beit al-Muqaddas and had lifted the siege. Thinking this, they ran towards the church, began celebrating. But when the next day's sun rose, and they saw that the Sultan had camped on the Mount of Olives, which was in front of Beit al-Muqaddas, and Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi's flags were waving on that mountain, then the city's Christians and the Muslim army present there were astonished and trembled upon seeing that the Sultan had erected 40 Mongols for bombardment on the city. After that, the Sultan began his work, and a part of the Sultan's army, which included about 10,000 cavalry, began attacking the city from the direction of Bab el-Sittin Gate of St. Stephen. After that, the Sultan's vanguard also began attacking the city. At the same time, bombardment and firework began on the city from the mangonels. The Muslims attacked the city repeatedly and tried to demolish a part of the city's wall. In defensive positions, The Christian army of Bait al-Muqaddas on the wall tried to stop the Muslims. But every attempt of theirs failed, as a result of which the Sultan succeeded in demolishing a part of the city's wall. Now, inside the city, cries and noise began to rise from everywhere. When the news spread in the city that the Muslims had demolished a part of the wall and would now try to enter the city through the demolished, people began to pray, began repenting from sins, and began going to the church in droves. They began harming themselves with stones and whips, begging Allah for mercy. Mothers cut their daughters' hair, and after stripping them, put them in cold water. Priests, monks, and other religious leaders, carrying large crosses, began roaming the city in procession, repenting and seeking forgiveness. But none of their prayers were accepted. The Sultan did not want to attack the city by entering through the demolished part of the wall, respecting the city. On the other hand, the city's ruler Balian, whomever he appointed on the demolished part of the wall, they would flee. Finally, he promised to give 100 ashrafis daily to those guarding the demolished part, but even then, no one would stay there at night. Along with this, the Christians inside the city began pressuring Balian to surrender to the Muslims. Otherwise, if the Muslims once entered the city, they would take revenge and kill countless people in that attack. Seeing this situation, the king and ruler of Bait al-Muqaddas, Balian, and the chief priest consulted with the people and decided that since a part of the wall had already collapsed, before the Muslims enter the city through the demolished part and conquer the city by force, they should present themselves to the Muslim Sultan and make peace. Therefore, this proposal was approved. Balian came to the Sultan's service with a delegation. The Sultan was sitting on the peak of the Mount of Olives at that time. When Balian spoke to the Sultan, Balian, addressing the Sultan, said, "Great Sultan of the Muslims, the Christians in Bait al-Muqaddas hate death and desire life. Pardon them. The city will be handed over to you. If you do not pardon, we will be convinced of our death, then by God, we will kill our daughters and women, set fire to the wealth and goods, and will not leave a single precious thing for you in the city. We will destroy the holy places of the Muslims inside the city. There are also some Muslim prisoners inside the city, we will kill them. The animals in the city, we will catch them and slit their throats, so that you get nothing to eat in the city." As long as Balian kept speaking, the Sultan kept looking at him silently, because the Sultan, sitting on the mountain peak, could see that his army had entered the city through the demolished part of the wall. When Balian fell silent, the Sultan addressed him and said, "What kind of foolish person are you? Are the terms of peace set for a free city?" Upon this, Balian was very ashamed. Then the Sultan, acting with mercy, did not prefer to massacre the Christians inside Bait al-Muqaddas in the way that the Christians had massacred the Muslims when they conquered Bait al-Muqaddas. Anyway, the Sultan ordered that every person of Bait al-Muqaddas be considered a prisoner, or everyone will have the freedom to leave the city and go wherever they wish. The city must be evacuated within 40 days. To leave the city, every man has to pay 10, every woman 5, and every child 1 ashrafi. The ransom for the poor who do not have the money will be paid from the money that was sent from England's Henry for Balian's aid. In this way, the city will be evacuated within 40 days. After 40 days, those who remain in the city will be considered slaves. The Christians accepted the Sultan's these terms and began evacuating the city. First, the city's governor, Balian, left after paying the money. After him, a stream of people leaving the city formed. People would pay the fixed amount and leave the city. The one who benefited the most was the chief priest of Bait al-Muqaddas. It is said he was a conscience seller and a hard-hearted man. He took the church treasures, gold vessels, jewels, and other valuable items and left after paying the ransom money. Some people complained that the old cunning man has immense wealth which he is taking with him, but the Sultan said, "Let him take whatever he is taking. We do not want to break our promise by stopping him." When many people had left the city, and the remaining were various poor people, then Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi acted with extreme kindness and paid their ransom from his own side and got them released. On this occasion, strange scenes were witnessed in Beit al-Muqaddas. Countless women came to the Sultan crying. On that occasion, the Sultan asked, "Why are these women crying? What do they want?" The Sultan was told that they are the wives and daughters of those soldiers whom the Sultan had captured during the war. The Sultan asked, "What do they want?" He was told that they are begging for mercy, asking for their husbands to be released. It is said that while those women were crying, the Sultan himself was standing in front of them, crying. His beard was wet. Therefore, he ordered that all their husbands be released. On that occasion, a Christian woman came to the Sultan's service. Her child was lost somewhere. She begged the Sultan, crying, to find and return her child. The Sultan's kindness was such that while the woman was crying in front of him, tears were also flowing from the Sultan's eyes. He ordered his soldiers to immediately search for the child. Consequently, upon the Sultan's order, the army swung into action, and the woman's child was found. The Sultan handed over her child to her. That woman left, blessing the Sultan. In this way the Sultan conquered Beit al-Muqaddas as the Christians had conquered it before, although there was a big difference between the Muslims and the Christians in conquering the city. When the Sultan conquered Beit al-Muqaddas, he behaved with extreme kindness. He did not kill anyone, pardoned everyone. But in contrast, in 1099 when the European Crusaders conquered the city, they played havoc inside the city. It is said that at that time, innocent Muslims were subjected to various tortures, burned alive, and were mercilessly slaughtered on the roof and minarets of the tomb of Jesus Christ, peace be upon him. When the news of Beit al-Muqaddas being conquered by the Muslims reached Europe, a kind of mourning and uproar spread in Europe. After conquering Beit al-Muqaddas, the Sultan wanted to conquer the city of Tyre with his army and headed towards it. Therefore, the chief Christian priest of Tyre went to Europe to seek help against the Sultan. Before that, the chief priest of Beit al-Muqaddas had also reached Europe and was inciting various countries and every king in Europe to rise with their armies and take back the areas that Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi has conquered in Palestine. In response to the call of these priests, first the King of England, Richard, moved. He took the cross from those priests and vowed to go to Palestine to fight the Muslims. After that, the King of France, Philip, also became determined to fight against the Muslims. After that, those priests turned to Germany. They also gave the cross to Germany's King Frederick and incited him against the Muslims. In this way, the kings of three great European countries, England, France, and Germany, set out for Palestine with their respective armies. Besides, the ruler of Sicily, William, also sent an army. Large armies from Denmark and Flanders also poured into Palestine. Now, almost the whole of Europe had risen in arms and marched to Palestine to fight Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi. Among them were thousands of women who had joined the army to encourage their soldiers and keep them determined to continue the war against the Muslims. During this period, another change also occurred. The former king of Beit al-Muqaddas, Guy of Lusignan, who had been captured by the Sultan in the Battle of Hattin and whom the Sultan had mercifully pardoned, also broke his promise and came out. He had promised the Sultan that henceforth he would not participate in wars against the Sultan, but secretly, through some representatives, he kept gathering an army. In this way, he had also gathered a very large army to fight against the Sultan. After that, when Guy received news that countless European armies were coming from Europe towards the port of Acre in Palestine, then Guy himself also set sail for Acre. In this way, a countless combined army of Christians gathered at the port of Acre, and they besieged the city of Acre. During the days when all of Europe had besieged the city of Acre, the Sultan was busy setting right the affairs in the inner regions of Homs, Hama al-Jazeera, and some other areas because some administrative matters had arisen in those areas from which the people of Europe took advantage, and in the Sultan's absence, besieged the city of Acre. It is said that when the Sultan reached the city of Acre, for miles outside Acre, various European armies that had come from Europe had besieged the city. The small Muslim army inside the city had great courage that it had held back such a large European army until then. But unfortunately, the besieged army inside the city had lost contact with the Sultan. The biggest problem that arose for the Muslims at that time was that the Sultan was seriously ill. He was suffering from colic pain, so he was not in a condition to participate in the war. The illness had increased his troubles. When his commanders requested him that this area is harmful for your health, so you should go to some other place for a change of air, the Sultan addressed them and said, "I want to drive the enemy away from here. Why should I not even risk my life in this endeavor?" On that occasion, despite his illness, the Sultan launched a terrible attack on the enemy, inflicted immense damage on them, and also captured many of their soldiers and commanders. But with them too the Sultan behaved well, treated them with better ethics, provided them with clothes, gave them warm clothes to protect them from the cold, and then allowed them to go back to their army. Whereas the Christians' treatment of Muslims was completely different from this. Since Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi was ill and could not participate in the war as usual, yet his soldiers attacked the French with such ferocity that the King of France, Philip, became terrified. Because the number of armies coming from Europe was in the hundreds of thousands, and Sultan Salahuddin eyed an army of only a few thousand. Therefore, the European forces occupying the city of Acre prevailed. But in that war of Acre, the King of France was so terrified that he handed over his army to a commander named the Duc d'I and fled back to France. He had estimated that if he tried to participate further in the wars, the Muslims would cut his throat. Therefore, for the sake of his safety, he thought it better to flee to France. All of Europe had risen against Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi. There was an army of several 100,000 that had invaded Palestine, and against them, Salahuddin alone had an army whose number was in the thousands, and no Muslim ruler was helping him at that time. Anyway, after retaking Acre from the Muslims, the European army, under the command of England's King Richard, set out from Acre. Now their intention was to go towards Jaffa and Ascalon, so that after conquering both cities, a final blow would be struck against Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi, and then Bait al-Muqaddas would also be taken back from him. When England's King Richard marched with his army from Acre towards Jaffa at that time, Sultan Salahuddin was camped with his army on a hill near Acre. From that hill, two roads were clearly visible below. One road went towards the east to Tiberias and Damascus, and the other went towards the south via Nazareth to Jerusalem. Anyway, Richard marched towards the city of Jaffa. When the enemy army moved, the Sultan also followed and began advancing with great cleverness within the mountain ranges. Now the situation of the advancing European armies was such that the sea was on their left, and within the sea, their naval fleet was accompanying them along, while on their right was the mountain range. And in the shelter of that same mountain range, the Sultan was also advancing along with them. The Sultan was looking for a suitable place where he could strike the immense European army and take revenge for the city of Acre. The Sultan had spread his informers in the area to keep an eye on the enemy. The next day, Richard camped with his army at the place of Haifa. Directly opposite, across the mountain range, Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi also stopped his army. The Sultan had given the command of his army to one of his commanders, Azizuddin Jarvi, and he himself went with a part of the army to the side, where the enemy army was to march the next day. The Sultan, with his army, calmed the entire area up to the place of Caesarea. Actually, he was looking for a suitable place he could strike the enemy. After surveying the entire area, The Sultan returned to his army and consulted with his commanders all night about attacking the enemy. The next day, when Richard reached the place of Caesarea with his army, a doom fell upon them because suddenly Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi appeared with his army on the hill that was on the right side of Richard's army. Then Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi and his soldiers, descending from the slopes, attacked Richard's army like a mountain torrent. First, the Sultan targeted the armies of England and other European countries. His archers, while performing archery, penetrated deep into the enemy ranks, and exhibiting excellent swordsmanship, they piled up corpses of Richard near Caesarea. There the French commander, to whom the King of France had handed over his army before fleeing back to France, stayed completely behind to save himself and his soldiers, and hid his army in an extremely safe place, so that they would not suffer damage from Muslim attacks, and their lives would not be lost. The European armies, France, Denmark, England, Flanders, Germany, and all other countries, were panicked by these attacks because when the Sultan returned after attacking them with his army, he left behind heaps of enemy corpses. After burying their dead, the European army, under Richard's command, began advancing again. Now their misfortune was that they had to pass through a narrow defile with their baggage animals laden with weapons and food. As soon as they began to pass through that narrow defile, the Sultan suddenly appeared like a hawk and attacked the enemy in such a way that the enemy was bewildered. Historians write that as a result of that attack, countless Christians were put to death, and the baggage carts filled with necessary items that they were taking were captured, and whoever from their army came forward to confront was cut down along with his horse. In this way, Richard's army suffered irreparable damage near that defile. Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi's attack was so severe and damaging that the European soldiers and suppliers panicked. Richard himself was in a bad state. After crossing this defile, when they camped in an open field, then inside Richard's army, the Europeans began to be heard crying. They were regretting why they had entered Palestine from Europe to fight against Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi. Many soldiers were calling out to Jesus Christ, peace be upon him, for help in a loud voice. At the same time, raising their hands towards the sky, they were crying profusely, begging Allah for mercy and help. And while crying bitterly, they were also expressing this desire that they had given proof of extreme foolishness and mistake by entering Palestine. The two attacks that the Sultan had launched on the enemy army on the way had caused them great damage. But the situation was that the soldiers coming from Europe were in the hundreds of thousands. Even then, they had an army of approximately 300,000, while the Sultan had only a few thousand soldiers, and with that, he had to attack the enemy, crush them, and defeat them. After inflicting immense damage on the enemy, the Sultan withdrew with his army. During the night, he gave his soldiers a chance to rest. He assigned a part of the army to stay awake so that the enemy would not harm Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi suddenly, and the Sultan himself, taking a few detachments, went forward. He was now surveying the roads through which the Europeans had to pass. Finally, the Sultan liked the field in that road called Arsuf, and the Sultan decided that he would launch a decisive attack on the Europeans in this very field of Arsuf, and show them in what manner Saladin and his soldiers can defend Palestine and its cities. The deadly attacks that Sultan Salahuddin had launched on Richard and his soldiers at night had, in a way, broken Richard's and his commanders' back. They had begun to be terrified of Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi. Out of this fear and dread, the king of Palestine, Richard, sent some messengers to Salahuddin Ayyubi and offered to make peace. But the Sultan rejected the terms of peace that were presented. Now there was no option for both armies but war. Richard and his other allied rulers and supporters again marched with their army and camped at a place called Nar al-Falak. Here, the Europeans stayed for one day and then began advancing and headed towards Arsuf. Meanwhile, Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi was lying in ambush with his army on the slope between Arsuf and Nar el-Falak. The European army advanced towards Arsuf, and Arsuf was the very field that Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi had chosen to attack the enemy. Finally, that equipped European army entered the field of Arsuf. They rested for one night, and the next day, when the European army got up ready, doom rose against them because first 10,000 Turks appeared before them. They were equipped with arrows, spears, and swords. In a forceful manner, they raised the chant of Allahu Akbar, then fell upon the European army like a storm and hurricane. Historians, especially Europeans, write that after the 10,000 Turks attacked, the black-skinned Muslims of Africa moved and began to advance and sweep over the enemy in such a way as if black clouds have enveloped everything. In this way, the Turks and African Muslims began to cut down a part of the European army. Richard and the other European rulers were still busy stopping the Turks and African Muslims, when a third problem arose for them because thousands of open-sleeved Arabs appeared from Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi's side. Coming close, they, like the Turks and African Muslims, raised the chants of Allahu Akbar loudly, then fell upon a part of the European army in such a way as storms and hurricanes pass noisily through dense forests. They began massacring the Europeans. After the Arabs, a short while later, another army of Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi appeared. With it were the Sultan himself and his commanders, and this fourth army of the Sultan consisted of Kurds who had the courage to sacrifice their lives and annihilate the enemy. After the Arabs, the Kurds also attacked, raising takbir, chanting Allahu Akbar, creating a stir in the entire enemy army, and they too began slaughtering the European army. Thus, in the field of Arsuf, the Turks, with their fierce nature and unwillingness to retreat, the black-faced African Muslims, attacking like lions, the open-sleeved Arabs, annihilating every enemy before them, and the Kurds, like mountain torrents and floods, attacked the European army. Sultan Salahuddin and his soldiers were furious with anger and rage, so much so that the European archers and swordsmen could not face them, and many of their soldiers, out of fear of death, threw away their bows and arrows and fled, and went to hide in the rear of their respective armies, so as not to be separated from their companions. But some Hospitallers and knights, on their part, tried to face the Arabs, Turks, Kurds, and African blacks with bravery and courage, but the Turks, Arabs, and Ethiopians crushed them in such a way as helpless grass is crushed underfoot. The Muslims' attacks were so forceful and dangerous that the Templars and Hospitallers, who were considered experts in swordsmanship and warfare in Europe, and people thought them incomparable, now had no strength left to stop the attacks of the Sultan's armies. Historians write that in this war, the condition of the European soldiers was strange. When the Muslims were attacking them, it felt as if their breaths would stop. Their trouble and severity were increasing. They were very troubled that they had such a large army, while Sultan Salahuddin, with a small army compared to them, had begun massacring them. On that occasion, long-range fighting with arrows had ended. Muslim soldiers now came out 10 by 10 for battle. Swords, spears, maces, all were being used freely against each other. Historians write that, when the Muslim swords fell on the shields of the European Christians, such sounds came out as if a heavy iron hammer had fallen upon them. At the time when Sultan Salahuddin and his soldiers were massacring the European invaders from all sides, and heaps of corpses of European soldiers were piling up. At that time, a European knight, who was considered incomparable, in a state of extreme helplessness and destitution, looking towards the sky, calling upon one of the saints, "Saint George! Why are you making us bite the dust? If this wretched enemy is not crushed, the world of Christ will be destroyed." European historians themselves admit that the Muslims' pressure on the European army had increased to such an extent that they had piled heaps of their corpses in the rear of their army, and every European soldier was ashamed to see this situation. England's King Richard and all the other European rulers had estimated that if their army stayed there, and the Muslims kept attacking them like this, very soon the time would come when the Sultan and his soldiers would annihilate the Europeans. Therefore, to save themselves and their soldiers, they began to advance. Sultan Salahuddin was also closely watching the enemy's movements. When the enemy began to advance, the Sultan gave a specific signal, in response to which his soldiers stopped attacking and gathered to one side. In this way, the Sultan withdrew with his army to one side, and then, exhibiting amazing daring, the Sultan, at great speed, took a long detour and went to the route on which the European army was to travel. Before the European army reached there, the Sultan had stationed his army there and prepared his ranks to fight them. Now, when the European army reached the place where Sultan Salahuddin was standing in their way, they were astonished to see the spectacle. They had already suffered considerable damage. Every European soldier, every commander, every king was being worn down fighting Sultan Salahuddin, was terrified. They were still lost in these thoughts when Sultan Salahuddin, taking turns calling out their names, challenged them to battle, invited them to compete. But surprisingly, neither England's King Richard nor the other European rulers responded to this challenge and call of Sultan Salahuddin. Rather, they remained completely silent and quiet. This was an indication that they were afraid to fight the Sultan. Therefore, they changed their direction, turned towards the left, and took refuge in the city of Jaffa. In this way, when the Sultan saw that the Europeans were avoiding fighting him, he also moved from there and camped on the road that went from to Jerusalem, so that his soldiers could get a chance to rest and relax. Now the condition of the European rulers' army was strange. Various rulers and commanders were, on their own, establishing contact with Sultan Saladin, so that peace could be made and they could be freed from war. There were some who had secretly begun negotiating with the Sultan, so that the Sultan would keep them under his subordination and make them governors of some areas so that they could live in peace. In this regard, a person named Conrad was the first to move from the European army. He started a series of messages with Sultan Salahuddin. He requested the Sultan's service that if the Sultan appointed him as the governor of the coastal cities of Sidon and Beirut, he would separate from the European army, would support the Sultan, would live as the Sultan's subordinate, and henceforth would support the Muslims instead of the Christians. But the Sultan was ready for war. He wanted to expel the European army from Palestine in every way. Therefore, the Sultan rejected that offer. Another chief, named Marcos, came to the Sultan's service, and in the Sultan's service, he made this request that the former ruler of Baqadas was Guy of Lusignan, whom the Sultan had defeated and released on the condition of not participating in war. But he acted treacherously towards the Sultan and participated in the war. Later, Balian became the governor of Beit al-Muqaddas. He also acted treacherously towards the Sultan. He assured the Sultan that if the Sultan appointed him as the governor of Beit al-Muqaddas on his behalf, or made him the ruler of some other area, he would support the Sultan. Even England's King Richard's condition was such that he also wanted peace, was avoiding war. He knew that if the war prolonged, Sultan Salahuddin and his soldiers would cut them down. Therefore, he also sent an ambassador to Sultan Salahuddin's service, and requested the Sultan that the area of Beit al-Muqaddas be given to him. The original cross that Sultan Salahuddin had taken from the Christians in the Battle of Hattin be returned. And in this way peace would be made, and the Europeans would go back. The Sultan's response to Richard's this offer is very noteworthy. The Sultan sent back the message, Beit al-Muqaddas is a holier place for us than for you, because from here, our Prophet, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, ascended to the heavens, and on the day of judgment, the entire Ummah will gather here. Do not ever think that we will desist from this or act upon your proposal. As for the areas of Palestine, they actually belong to us. You had conquered them in the past by taking advantage of the Muslims' weakness. If at that time the Muslims had not been weak and had they been united, you Europeans could never have conquered these areas. And listen, as long as the war continues, God willing, you will not be able to move a single stone of it. As for your original cross, it will remain in my possession, and as long as it is beneficial for us, we will keep it with us. We can only desist from it for the benefit of Islam. When England's King Richard saw that Sultan Salahuddin did not accept any proposal, did not agree to give the demanded areas, then to escape from war, he used another trick. He offered the Sultan that he would give his sister, Joan, who was once the Queen of Sicily, in marriage to the Sultan's brother, Salahuddin Ayyubi, and the Sultan on his part would give the cities of Acre, Ascalon, and Jaffa as dowry to Richard's sister. The remaining areas of Palestine, Salahuddin would hand over to his brother, and in this way, this husband and wife would rule over Palestine. Secondly, Richard said that the Holy Cross be handed over to the Christians, and thirdly, that the Sultan release the Christian prisoners he has, and if these terms are accepted, the European army will go back. Richard was so terrified of fighting Sultan Salahuddin that he wanted peace at any cost. But when the Sultan refused to accept any of his conditions, then he invited the Sultan's brother, Al-Malik Adil, through his ambassador. Al-Malik al-Adil was a brave and courageous man. Anyone else would not have gone to the enemy's army, but upon Richard's invitation, he went to his army. Richard entertained him excellently, welcomed him. Actually, he wanted to win over Salahuddin and make peace to escape from war. But that did not happen. Finally, Richard even offered the Sultan that if the Sultan did not want to marry Al-Adil to his sister Joan, he was ready to marry his beautiful and young niece to Al-Adil, but the war should be ended. But the Sultan rejected Richard's this offer as well. Now the winter season had reached its peak. The lands of Palestine and Sham had a great influence of seasons. Therefore, when it rained, the cold took hold. To keep his soldiers in a safe place, Sultan Salahuddin stationed a part of the army at the place of Ramla, from where a road went to Beit al-Muqaddas. And with the rest of the army, he went towards Beit al-Muqaddas. Now the rains had started, and a scene of mud and swamp had set in all around. Richard and the other European rulers, despite staying for so long, had not yet understood the local seasons. Therefore, in the month of December, the European army, with all its supporters, marched on the road that went to Beit al-Muqaddas. They would have advanced about 8 miles towards Beit al-Muqaddas, when doom befell them because the Sultan, though he was residing in Beit al-Muqaddas at that time, his informer had informed him of the enemy's advance. Therefore, the Sultan reached Ramla with lightning speed, where his army was already stationed. As soon as the Europeans advanced towards Ramla, the Sultan attacked the European army with extreme ferocity. Blood began to flow on the battlefield. Corpses began to scatter here and there. Now the Sultan and his soldiers did another thing. They began attacking the baggage animals of the European army along with attacking the enemy, and began seizing the animals laden with weapons and food from the Europeans. In this way, the Sultan began hitting the enemy with a double calamity. During this, storms of cold and snowfall arose. Heavy rain and strong winds were blowing away the tents. Horses began to die from the cold and dampness. Along with this, the necessary items that the Europeans had, the Sultan and his soldiers began to snatch. The pork that the Europeans had stored had rotted and spoiled, became inedible. Besides, the Europeans had rusty swords, spears, and other weapons that had become so rusty, due to the rain, that they could not be cleaven after repeated rubbing, while on the other hand, Sultan Salahuddin and his army had shining swords and spears. In this way, in the mud, swamp, and snowfall, the European armies once again faced a worse defeat at the hands of Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi and were forced to retreat. Seeing their army being massacred in this way, most of the European commanders begged Richard and the other rulers to withdraw the army. Otherwise, the Sultan and his soldiers will cut down most of our army. They also pleaded that the entire area has become mud and swamp due to the rain. Tents cannot be pitched, and the soldiers are insisting that they be given a chance to rest. Actually, the European soldiers did not want to continue the war with Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi and his soldiers. They could see their death before them. Therefore, they wanted to retreat. On this basis, Richard, after consulting with the other European rulers, decided to retreat. But as soon as the Europeans retreated, the Sultan and his soldiers again fell upon them in the snowfall and heavy rain. The Europeans were surprised that they themselves and their horses were drenched in mud, and the horses were stuck in the swamp. They could not even walk, let alone run fast. And their own soldiers, the more they tried to get out of the swamp, the more they got stuck in it. While Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi and his soldiers were running in the mud and swamp, attacking them as if they were running on hard ground. Seeing their condition, despair and hopelessness had overcome the Europeans, and they had become wary of their lives. Finally, with great difficulty, the European army retreated, having its companions killed. Accepting defeat, they had headed towards the city of Ascalon. On the other hand, Sultan Salahuddin, after driving away the enemy and giving them a worse defeat and massacring them greatly, had gone back towards Beit al-Muqaddas to give his army rest. However, he had stationed a small part of his army in Ramla, as before, to keep an eye on the enemy. Upon reaching the outskirts of Ascalon, when Richard and the other European rulers assessed their respective armies, they found that in the war fought near Ramla, countless of their soldiers had been killed. They had themselves seen that the outskirts of Ramla had turned red with their corpses and blood. After such destruction and devastation of their armies, Richard consulted with everyone, and then it was decided that they were tired of confronting Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi, could not stand before him, and did not have the courage to take back the areas of Palestine that Salahuddin had taken from them. And if they continued the series of battles further, then they would suffer more loss, and none of them would be able to return to Europe safely. Under those circumstances, it was decided to leave the matter as it is and return to Europe. Therefore, Richard and his other ruler companions set out for the port of Acre, because their naval fleet had already set sail for Acre. They wanted to board the naval fleet at the port of Acre and depart. On the way to Acre, England's king commanded and said, "You are assigned to protect and look after the Muslim prisoners. Have you ever asked them what their sultan is like? What kind of person is he who has forced all of Europe to bow before him? Our army of hundreds of thousands could not harm his few thousand army, and he kept defeating our army in various places, reducing our army's number. What kind of man is he? How has he managed to defeat such large armies with such a small army?" Upon this, Richard's companion smiled and said, "I have certainly been among the Muslim prisoners, and I myself was very curious to know about their sultan. I kept asking the prisoners questions and learned a lot from them. Whatever I could ask them, I will tell you in detail. Those prisoners said that the spirit of jihad and religious enthusiasm is the most prominent and important in Sultan Saladin's life. They said that he is fundamentally opposed to bloodshed, is non-warlike by nature, but when the question of religion, faith, and homeland arises, and someone attacks them, then he completely changes. They also said that their sultan is never intimidated by the enemy's numbers. He knows the skill of defeating the largest armies. He listens to plans of every kind with great calm, and then acts upon the one that seems appropriate to him after consultation. The prisoners said that their sultan has dedicated his body, soul, and wealth for jihad, and during confrontation with disbelief, he thinks of nothing but jihad. They said that their sultan has sacrificed his comfort, his happiness, and every pleasure for his faith and his homeland. He dreams of even greater battles for the elevation of Islam. The only thing on his mind is that he will take back the areas of Palestine that the Europeans had captured by taking advantage of Muslim disunity, and will push those coming from Europe back into the sea. Those prisoners also said that once their sultan asked his companion, "What is a glorious death?" In response, his companion told him, "Giving one's life in the path of Allah is the highest and most virtuous death." Hearing this, Salahuddin, expanding his chest, said, "I also desire such a death." The prisoners said that he has dedicated his strength, health, and even his life to jihad against the Christians. He takes great care of his soldiers, fulfills their every need. The prisoners also said that Sultan Salahuddin is a religious Muslim. His religion is his entire existence, and he is strict only in matters of religion. However, in this regard, the prisoners also said that he cannot tolerate anyone who works against the principles of Sharia in front of him. On this basis, he is against the Hellenistic and liberal Palestinians, and often punishes them. His own religion is very straightforward, solid, and true. During jihad, he fasted for 2 years of missed fasts. After that, despite continuous illness and constant hard work, he again kept fasts for 2 consecutive months that were harmful to his health, but he did not care about it. Muslims who perform their worship, which they call prayer. Those prisoners said that he performs the 5 daily prayers with great regularity. No one is more punctual in attending the mosque on Friday than him. It is said that when the Qari of his sultanate recites from their religious book in front of him, he often bursts into tears. Tears flow down his cheeks and wet his beard. After saying this, when Richard's companion fell silent, Richard said in a sorrowful tone, "If the Muslim sultan is a person of such character, then I believe we cannot defeat him on any front, nor can we crush him. Nor can we take back from him the areas that he has taken from the Christians, because he is protecting these areas very well, and not letting anyone come near these areas, nor will he allow anyone to capture them." Richard, again addressing his companions, said, "Do you know anything more about the Muslim sultan? Tell me, because adopting the character of such a person is also a great blessing." Upon this, his companion said, "I have heard from the prisoners that he respects scholars, listens to their lectures with great interest, and also participates in them himself. Besides, he also feels proud in doing public works." The prisoners were saying that their sultan has done various works for the construction of forts, and when the work of strengthening the forts begins, their sultan runs with stones on his shoulders and never feels tired while doing such work. In such works, he works from morning till afternoon, and then from Asr prayer till night. They said that their sultan's entire life passed in simple toil, and was completely free from luxury. They were saying that the Muslims had built a beautiful resting place for the sultan in Damascus. When it was completed, they requested the sultan the resting place they had built on their own. It is said that when the sultan went to see that resting place, after looking at it, he glanced wrongly and said, "We are not going to live here forever. This house can never be of any use to a person who awaits death. Our purpose in life is to worship Allah." The prisoners said that the sultan hates luxury and body pampering. Besides, he is very kind even to his children and his employees. One prisoner told us that once, the sultan's companion, who was riding a horse, was going. It was the rainy season. On that occasion, the splashes from Bahadin's horse fell on the sultan. Bahadin became worried that the sultan would feel it. But when he looked towards the sultan was smiling. On that occasion, it is said that Bahadin wanted to put his horse behind the sultan, so that no more splashes would fall on the sultan, but the sultan did not permit him to go behind. Similarly, it is said that once an employee threw a shoe, and it fell near the sultan. Upon this, the sultan turned his face away and smiled, and made it appear to his employee as if he had not seen the shoe falling near him. The prisoners were telling another great quality, that he sits twice a week with some kitsis. judge and decides people's cases and does justice. They were saying that in the court, he neither favors anyone nor allows anyone's intercession, nor is he accustomed to giving anyone undue favor. If someone files a case against the Sultan or his sons, the Sultan and his sons themselves also have to appear in court like ordinary people. They were saying that if the Sultan or his sons win the case, they are not angry with those who filed the case, but reward them with prizes and honors, so that they may also keep an eye on the negligence in the future. And his nature is so kind that it is said once a Christian prisoner was presented in the Sultan's service. At that time, he was trembling with fear, but upon seeing the Sultan, he said, "Before seeing the Sultan's face, I was terrified, but now that I have seen the Sultan, I am convinced that he will not harm me." Hearing this, the Sultan smiled and released the prisoner. When Richard's companion fell silent, Richard, after a strange thought and reflection, said, "If the Muslim Sultan has these qualities, then all of Europe and all its rulers and commanders, even if they try for their entire lives, cannot subdue him. In my opinion, instead of fighting such a Sultan, it is better for us to return." All the European rulers had made complete preparations to return when an extremely regrettable incident occurred, because Sultan Salahuddin's nephew, Taqiyuddin, who was the governor of Al-Jazeera, passed away. Then some selfish and greedy people created a rebellion in Al-Jazeera, and the situation there deteriorated. Seeing this situation, Sultan Salahuddin sent his brother, Salahuddin al-Adil, and his son, al-Fadl, with a part of the army so that they could Jazeera and control the situation and crush the rebellious people there. When this news reached Richard and the other European rulers, they were advised that they would not get a better opportunity than this to strike the Muslims because a large part of Sultan Saladin's had gone with his brother and son to Al-Jazeera, and the Sultan currently has only half of his army with which he has to face us. If we attack now, the Muslim Sultan will not be able to stop our way till Jerusalem, and the Europeans will succeed in capturing Beit al-Muqaddas. The King of England, Richard, and all the other European rulers decided to take advantage of that opportunity. Therefore, they turned and advanced towards a small Muslim fort called Darum. Here, Sultan Salahuddin had a small army. The entire European army, which was like a flood, attacked this fort in such a way that the small defensive force inside the fort could not stop such a large army. The Europeans conquered the fort and put to death the defensive forces inside it. It is said that in that fort named Darum, there were 300 soldiers. Their families were also with them. Richard and his allied rulers attacked them and annihilated them. After massacring a few Muslims in Darum, the European spirits rose, and they began to think that just as they attacked Darum and conquered this fort, killed the Muslims there, they could do the same with other areas. On this basis, the disheartened and hopeless ones, who were about to return, again had their spirits lifted. Once again, that they would achieve success against the Muslim Sultan, Salahuddin Ayyubi. After capturing Darum and killing 300 armed youths there, the Europeans felt revived because before this, they had been consistently defeated by the Sultan, suffering defeat after defeat. Therefore, after capturing Darum, they gained some courage, although they did not know that the number of the army they had powered there was only 300, and they were in the hundreds of thousands. Anyway, after capturing Darum, the European rulers advanced with their army and camped at a place called Beit Nuba. On the other hand, Sultan Salahuddin understood that since half of his army had been taken by his younger brother, Salahuddin, and son Fadl, towards Al-Jazeera, therefore, the European Christians have taken advantage of this situation and have again come out for war. Anyway, with whatever army he had, he gathered them, and addressing them, Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi made his historic speech with a few sentences. He addressed his soldiers and said, "My companions, the life and families of the Muslims are a trust with you. God forbid. If you fail, the enemy will wrap your country like a bolt of cloth. The Muslims of the entire country are relying on your courage and bravery. Historians write that the Sultan could only say this much when one of his commanders, Al-Mastuba, with reverence and devotion, addressing Sultan Salahuddin, began to say, "Our master, we are your subjects and slaves. You have been kind to us. You have made us so powerful that we cannot express it. We offer our necks to be sacrificed for you, and they are in your hands. By God, every one of us will support you until the last moment of our lives." After Al-Mastuba, it is said that every commander of the Sultan stood up from his place one by one and expressed similar sentiments. So the Sultan was comforted that although he had half an army, which was nothing compared to the Christian army, it would certainly confront the enemy. It is said that after this speech, the Sultan performed the Maghrib prayer with his army. The Sultan and all his commanders kept worshipping all night, and also kept consulting with each other. On that occasion the Sultan was somewhat restless, because the army he had was almost non-existent. It is said that then Friday came. On that day the Sultan performed his prayer with more humility and submission than usual. He kept praying slowly. People were watching him intently. Historians say that while Sultan Salahuddin was praying on Friday, he was crying inwardly, and tears were dripping and being absorbed in his beard. After that prayer, the Sultan gained some courage, and with whatever army he had, he set out. At night, Sultan Salahuddin headed towards Beit Nuba, where the Christian army was camped. The European rulers and kings were firmly convinced that Sultan Salahuddin would never come out and attack them under these circumstances. But they were not aware of Sultan Saladin's special quality. Sultan Salahuddin had only one goal in front of him, that he would protect the Muslim areas like a solid wall in front of any enemy in every situation. He had made that goal a part of his life and his being. And then, the Sultan did not rely on the number of the army either. On this basis, with the small army he had, he set out and resolved to clash with the hundreds of thousands of European army. At night, when every individual was sleeping deeply, the European army was also resting, having taken off their weapons, because all the European rulers were thinking that under these circumstances, Sultan Salahuddin cannot attack them because he has a small army, while a large part of his army has been taken by his brother, Adil and son, Al-Fal, both to Al Jazeera. And they were also thinking that after staying in Beit Nuba for a couple of days, they would advance, and no one would stop their way till Beit al-Muqaddas, because Sultan Salahuddin would not come before them with a small army. But at night, when there was silence everywhere, the Sultan attacked the European army. The Sultan's soldiers entered the European army like shepherds entered a herd helpless sheep. This attack was so terrifying that the Turks, Kurds, Egyptians, and African blacks played such a game of spear, fighting and swordsmanship that the Europeans were astonished. England's King Richard and the European rulers had killed 300 youths in the fort of Durham and captured the fort. But here at night, the Sultan put to death thousands of European warriors and Surma knights and other brave men. At the time when the Sultan and his soldiers were attacking, a storm of cries and moans arose in the European army. The wounded were screaming and shouting. The dying were reddening the ground. No one could understand what kind of torment had fallen upon them, because they were sure from Sultan Salahuddin's side that he would not attack them with a small army. When they received the news that the attacker is Sultan Salahuddin himself, and he has caused significant damage to their army, has completely cut down a large part of their army, then they quickly prepared and wanted to carry out a counter-operation against the Sultan. But by then, Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi had already withdrawn, after cutting down a significant portion of their army. Now the European rulers did not have the courage to go towards where Sultan Salahuddin had gathered his army and left at night. The next day, when the European rulers assessed the damage to their army, they were stunned. A large part of their army had been put to death. The camp was strewn with corpses, and then the food, drink, and war material they had in their camp were also taken away by Sultan Salahuddin's soldiers, who took them with them. Now, the Sultan had nothing compared to the defensive army in front of him, and his brother was not with him. His son Al-Fadl was separate from him, and his nephew, who used to be his excellent companion in wars and whose name was Taqiyuddin, had also been killed. Therefore, at that critical moment, the Sultan did not want to leave the enemy in such a condition that they could march towards Bait al-Muqaddas. Therefore, from where the European army had camped, on the road that went to Bait al-Muqaddas, the Sultan kept putting poison in the ponds and reservoirs that were on the way so that no European with the courage to advance towards Bait al-Muqaddas. The next day, Richard, the other European rulers, commanders, and leaders all gathered in one place and began to ponder that now that the Sultan has suddenly attacked and caused them immense damage, what course of action should they adopt? On that occasion, some hotheads advised that we should immediately march with our army towards Bait al-Muqaddas. The Muslim Sultan will not be able to stop our way because even now, the army we have is 20 times larger than Sultan Salahuddin's army. But in the European army, the great knights, Templars, Hospitallers, who considered themselves professional warriors, regarding whom the Europeans thought that they were incomparable, and no one could defeat them, were also worried. They knew that if Sultan Salahuddin launched another attack like the past night, he would cut them all down. They also feared that if they started advancing towards Bait al-Muqaddas on this occasion, then despite the small number of his army, Sultan Salahuddin would come before them and would not leave them without giving them defeat. Therefore, all advised England's King Richard and the other rulers that we should abandon the intention of attacking Bait al-Muqaddas for now and should launch another campaign. We should ignore Salahuddin and Bait al-Muqaddas and immediately head for Egypt, and after capturing the capital city of Egypt, Cairo, gradually spread and capture the whole of Egypt. Those people further said that in Egypt, Sultan Salahuddin's brother, Al-Adil, is the governor, and he is not in Egypt currently. The Egyptian army has also been taken by him, and currently, he has gone with that army with the Sultan's son, Al-Fadl, to suppress the rebellion in Al-Jazeera. If they attack Egypt now, they can occupy Egypt without any resistance. The Europeans were actually afraid of fighting Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi, did not want to face him. They knew that if again there was to face war with the Sultan would again put to death a large part of their army. The Christians of Sham had advised to leave Bait al-Muqaddas and attack Egypt. The French commander, the Duke of Burgundy, and his other commanders extremely disliked this advice. They expressed immense anger and said to Richard, "How can we attack Egypt? We do not dare to advance towards Bait al-Muqaddas, which is only a few miles from here, for fear that Sultan Salahuddin might cut us down. Then how can we attack and occupy Egypt, which is 250 miles from here, and the route has desert in between?" The French also expressed the fear that if we leave here and head for Egypt and enter the desert of Sinai, remember, the desert Bedouins will pounce from all sides like vultures, and will play the game of destruction and devastation at every step. And if Sultan Salahuddin's informer informs him that we have gathered our entire army and marched to attack Egypt, forgetting Bait al-Muqaddas, then remember, he will set out after us with his army. And if he attacks us inside the desert of Sinai, then he will play a worse game of death with us. He will surround our army just as he surrounded and destroyed a very large Christian army in the field of Hattin. In this way, going towards Egypt, he will kill us with thirst in the desert of Sinai, and none of us will be fortunate enough to reach Egypt. The French also said that if we cannot dare to attack Bait al-Muqaddas, and are afraid to face Sultan Salahuddin, then we should retreat. We should not even think of attacking Egypt. This will be like arranging our own destruction and devastation with our own hands. If we have decided to ignore Beit al-Muqaddas, then instead of going towards Egypt, it is better that we go back to our homes in Europe and, upon returning, tell the Europeans that we are tired of confronting Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi, cannot overcome him, and he, despite having a small army compared to us, kept causing us immense damage and came out victorious against us. After the French's that proposal, some other European commanders also told Richard and the other rulers that the French are right. We cannot succeed in attacking Egypt in any way, nor can we occupy any area. If we do this, we will arrange for the destruction and death of our entire army. It is better that we withdraw from here and return to Europe. Upon this, an English commander asked, "What should we do with the little area we currently have in Palestine?" After consultation, it was decided that the city of Jaffa is currently with the Christians. Besides the local Christians, a fairly large European army should be kept there. After that, the rest of the army should set out for Acre and from there, board the naval fleet and set sail for Europe. And the army that is kept in Jaffa should be assigned the task of protecting the few areas that the Christians had in Palestine, and a ruler should be appointed for those areas. England's King Richard liked this idea. He decided that a large army be kept in Jaffa, and the commander of that army and the ruler of the few areas that the Christians have inside Palestine be made his nephew, Henry. All the other rulers also agreed with this proposal. Therefore, a fairly large army was kept in the city of Jaffa, and not only was Richard's nephew, Henry, appointed as the commander of that army, but he was also made the ruler of the few areas they had in Palestine. And along with that, all the European rulers retreated with their respective armies. Now they wanted to go Acre once again and from there, return to their respective countries. This was a very great misfortune for the European army, and they themselves considered it their bad luck that they could not take advantage of any weakness of Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi. Half of Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi's army had gone with his brother, Salahuddin, and son, Al-Fadl, towards Al-Jazeera. Half the army was with Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi. Despite this, the people of Europe, with such a large army, could not remove Sultan Salahuddin from their way and advance towards Beit al-Muqaddas. Rather, with a small army, the Sultan not only blocked their way, but also caused them such great and irreparable damage that now the European army was again forced to return. Although Sultan Salahuddin had a small army, there was an anger and grief in his heart that in his absence, the people of Europe had suddenly attacked his small fort of Darum and put to death his 300 armed youths there. Although in Beit Nuba, by killing at night, Sultan Salahuddin had put to death thousands of European soldiers, still Sultan wanted to teach the people of Europe a lesson for the devastation of Darum, and for that, he chose the city of Jaffa. In the city of Jaffa, England's King Richard's nephew Henry was present. He had a very large army with him, and moreover, Richard and the other European rulers had made Henry the ruler of the areas that the Christians had in Palestine. The army that the Christians had in the city of Jaffa was even larger in number than the army that Sultan Salahuddin had at that time. But ignoring the abundance and shortage of the army, the Sultan advanced towards Jaffa with great speed. He wanted to attack Jaffa and, after putting to death the Christian army there, capture Jaffa. Richard and the other European rulers had set out with their army for the city of Acre. The Sultan advanced with his army with great speed towards Jaffa. He besieged the city of Jaffa. Inside the city of Jaffa was Richard's nephew Henry. He also had a very large army, but he did not have the courage and daring to come out of the city of Jaffa and face Sultan Salahuddin's small army. As a result, the Sultan advanced and besieged the city of Jaffa. The Sultan had small, light and fast-moving mangonels. The Sultan positioned them inside the city and began bombarding the city with great speed. And along with that, the Sultan ordered his archers to shoot arrows at the bastions built on the wall of Jaffa and the Christians. Such a way that they are forced to come down from the wall. The Sultan's intention was to bring down the defensive Christian army inside the wall, and using ropes and ladders, climb the wall with his army and enter the city and clash with the Christian army and try to capture the city. But before that, the Sultan's Mongol operators and sappers did a feat. They demolished a part of the wall of Jaffa city. As soon as a part of the wall collapsed, the European army inside the city gathered near the collapsed part of the wall. And when it gathered, it was found that its number was several times greater than Sultan Salahuddin's army. But from the collapsed part of the wall, with great bravery and courage, the Sultan attacked them. European soldiers began to be put to death rapidly. Historians write that one man would die, and another would take his place because their number was much greater than Sultan Salahuddin's army. They wanted to defend the city of Jaffa in every way. The Sultan and his legion slaughtered the enemy in such a way they reduced the number of their army to less than their own army. In this way, the defense of Jaffa city weakened before Salahuddin. Then, in the blink of an eye, Muslim soldiers began to annihilate the enemy's legion, entered the city, and they captured the city. Inside the city, there was a small fortress in which the defeated Christian army had taken refuge. The Sultan began to attack it with a severe siege and defeated the enemy. The remaining European army there surrendered to the Sultan, begged that they be allowed to leave the city peacefully. The Sultan himself was very merciful, but his soldiers were extremely furious because, since they had received the news that by deceit, Richard and the other European rulers had put the Muslims to death in the fort of Darum, since then they were out for revenge. Upon entering the city, the Muslims began slaughtering the Christians. The Turks, Arabs, Egyptians, and slaughtering them like shepherds herd sheep and goats. In this way, the European army was massacred greatly. In this revenge and anger, it was almost certain that the Muslim soldiers, after annihilating the European army in Jaffa city, would also raise their hands against the Christian residents of Jaffa city. But upon the Sultan's word, the Sultan's excellent commander, Salahuddin Ayyubi, moved and stopped his soldiers from taking revenge. In this way, Sultan Salahuddin, with a small army, defeated the European army several times larger than his and conquered Jaffa. Some European soldiers fleeing from Jaffa reached Richard, and in his presence, tore their clothes and, crying, narrated the tale of the city's destruction, and told him the condition that befell them, and their army after the city was conquered. And they also told Richard that most of the European army in Jaffa has been put to death by Sultan Salahuddin and his soldiers. Hearing this terrible news, Richard fell into a strange state of thought and perplexity. He had intended to return, his soldiers were also shying away from war. The other European rulers also did not want to fight Sultan Salahuddin. They knew that in the previous wars, the Sultan had already reduced their armies by killing them. Upon this, the European women in the army began to taunt their soldiers that the Muslim Sultan, with a small army, has destroyed and devastated a larger army in Jaffa and taken revenge, and no European ruler is ready to take revenge for them. Rather, they are preparing to return to Europe. Tired of these taunts, England's King Richard and the other rulers, instead of going to Europe, turned back and headed for the city of Jaffa to confront Sultan Salahuddin. It is said that on the conquest of Jaffa, the Muslim soldiers got so much booty that they became wealthy for life. European historians themselves admit that when Sultan Salahuddin conquered Jaffa, although he did not permit his soldiers to loot and plunder the city still, so much wealth fell into the soldiers' hands. They became carefree for their livelihood for life. When Sultan Salahuddin received the news that England's King Richard and the other European rulers have returned, instead of going back to take revenge for Jaffa, he came out of the city and began his preparations to face the enemy. Here the situation was strange. The Sultan still did not have his full army. His brother, Salahuddin al-Adil, and son, al-Fadl, who had gone to Al-Jazeera, had not yet returned. Any other ruler would have taken refuge somewhere with his small army against such a large European army, and would not have confronted. But Sultan Salahuddin, pounding his chest, prepared to clash with the European army. The King of England, Richard, and the other rulers were so terrified of clashing with Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi, that as soon as they reached near Jaffa with their army, they sent a messenger to Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi. That messenger first presented Richard's salute to Sultan Salahuddin and, along with that, presented Richard's this request to the Sultan. That much blood of soldiers is being shed. I want to cross the sea very soon. Therefore, my request to the Sultan is that he make peace with us. Richard also sent this message to Sultan Salahuddin that his request to the Sultan is that he bestow the cities of Jaffa and Ascalon upon the Christians. This will be his kindness. If Sultan Salahuddin does this, Richard will feel proud to be called the Sultan's man. If ever the opportunity comes, he will be ready to work even as an ordinary soldier in the Sultan's army, under the Sultan's command. If the Sultan does us this favor, we will accept the Sultan's terms and go back. But Sultan Salahuddin refused to accept such a proposal. On that occasion, any other ruler, and if he had such a small army, would have accepted the Christians. This proposal, in this way, they would have gone back. But the Sultan refused to give them the demanded areas, and sent a message to England's King Richard, that if he can spend the winter season away from his country, and his dear ones, and he is young at this time, then he should realize how many winter seasons I can spend. I am in my homeland, my family is with me, I can get whatever I want. I am an old man. The luxuries and pleasures of the world are insignificant in my eyes. I have enjoyed life to the full, and now I am unrelated to such matters. My faith is that I am performing the best service of my religion and my nation, and I will never desist from performing these duties. As long as Allah wills, He will keep me successful. When Sultan Salahuddin rejected all the offers of the Europeans, did not accept and refused to give the demanded areas, then once again a confrontation occurred between the two armies. It is said that this confrontation was very strange, because compared to the European army, the army that Sultan Saladin had was like salt and flour, and then Sultan Salahuddin's brother, who was his right hand, had not yet returned from Al-Jazeera, and his elder son, Azal, was also there. In the bloody battle that took place, the great swordsmen of Europe attacked with full force from their side, but when the Sultan countered their attack and carried out a counter operation, the European soldiers began to retreat like terrified sheep. On that occasion, a lion-hearted Muslim soldier thrust a spear so hard into the horse of England's King Richard that the horse could not bear the thrust, fell to the ground, and along with that, England's King Richard himself also fell from the horse. Seeing this situation, the Sultan, raising his hand, stopped the war. On that occasion, any other ruler would have advanced and cut the throat of England's King Richard, but the Sultan did not do so. He was a just and merciful Sultan. After stopping the war, the Sultan ordered one of his commanders in a loud voice to provide 2 excellent horses to the King of England, so that he can mount the horse and again compete with me. Finally, upon the Sultan's order, 2 horses were presented to Richard during the war. One of Richard's companions advised that he should not mount the horses of the Muslims. If he does so, he will suffer, because the Muslims' horses are trained, and lest if he mounts a horse sent by the Sultan, the horse takes him to the Sultan's army. Upon this, Richard, with seriousness, addressed his companion and said, "This cannot be, because that Sultan of the Muslims who stopped the war when I fell from my horse and provided me with horses, such an expectation cannot be held from him. At the time when I fell from the horse, he could have advanced and cut my throat, and none of my soldiers could have stopped him, but he did not do so. This is his nobility, his generosity, his courage, and his daring, which we cannot match. Richard's companion had advised not to mount the horse. Therefore, Richard rejected his advice and mounted the horse. As soon as he mounted the horse, the Sultan gave the order to start the war again. His soldiers, despite being fewer in number, again entered the enemy's army and began playing the game of death. Richard and his commanders and the other European rulers were surprised and troubled that these Muslim soldiers, in the service of their Sultan, raising takbir, are again entering their army and beginning to slaughter. Finally, the war continued until evening, and during this war, Sultan Salahuddin made the condition of the army several times larger than his worse, and put to death countless of its soldiers, made the battlefield not only bloody, but also filled with the corpses of the Christians. Falling from the horse, the Sultan providing the horse, and then the massacre of his army at the hands of the Muslims, made Richard disheartened, and he had realized that he cannot fight the Sultan, nor can he achieve victory against him. Therefore, he would accept defeat and return. But those of his soldiers who wanted to stay in Palestine and gain benefits for themselves were inciting him for war. When night came, the grief of his soldiers being killed, falling from the horse, then the Sultan stopping the war and providing horses, and then the massacre of his army until evening, had such a deep effect on Richard that he fell ill. Now, it is not known whether he actually fell ill or was making an excuse to avoid war. Anyway, the next day, there was no war. The Sultan sent his informer towards the enemy's army to see why the enemy is not preparing for war. Until then, the Sultan's informer reported that England's King Richard has fallen ill. Therefore, they cannot continue the war. It is said that the Sultan wanted to strike the final blow on the enemy, but did not want to take advantage of his weakness. This was the Sultan's justice, his courage and bravery. He wanted the enemy to come before him fully prepared, and he would massacre them and give them a worse defeat. On Richard's falling ill, Sultan Saladin was very disappointed. Actually, the Sultan wanted him to recover from the illness quickly and come before him so that there would be a clash between the Sultan and him, and a decision would be made between Sultan Salahuddin and the Europeans. On that occasion, the Sultan, on his own, sent sherbet, peaches, other fruits, and cold water for England's King Richard. When these things were brought by Sultan Salahuddin's messenger to Richard, his commanders, and the other European rulers were very surprised and troubled. When that messenger finished presenting those things, Richard asked him, "Why has your Sultan sent these things for me when I am your enemy and fighting against you?" Upon this, with great sincerity, the Sultan's messenger said, "The Sultan is not accustomed to delaying in war. The Sultan has sent these things to you, so that you may quickly recover and again get ready to fight the Sultan. The Sultan wants to strike you such a blow that you accept your defeat and failure and agree to return to Europe unsuccessful and unlucky." Sultan Salahuddin's messenger made Richard and his other companion rulers surprised and astonished. On that occasion, Richard, addressing his companions and other rulers, said, "Such a ruler who stops the war when I fell from my horse and provides horses, such a ruler who sends cold water and fresh fruits when his enemy is ill, O my companions, in my opinion, such a ruler will not be found anywhere in the world. This is only the Muslim Sultan, Salahuddin. He provided me with a horse so that I may mount the horse and come before him." Richard could only say this much when the messenger said, "King of England, the real reason for providing you with the horse was that the Sultan knew that he would defeat you in the war. The Sultan wanted that the coming historian should not write that the King of England was defeated because he fell from his horse and did not have a horse. The Sultan provided you with the horse so that you may face him mounted on the horse. Then he would defeat you and force you to retreat." The messenger was extremely intelligent. After that, the messenger left. After recovering from the illness, Richard did not make any decision to fight Sultan Salahuddin. Now he himself was avoiding war, and along with him, the countless European rulers who had come with their respective armies from Europe also did not want war. Therefore, they requested the Sultan that Christians may come and go in Palestine, and the Sultan should permit Christian pilgrims to visit the tomb of Jesus Christ, peace be upon him, in Beit al-Muqaddas. The Sultan, acting with mercy, permitted that Christians may visit their holy places in the Muslims' areas. After receiving permission from the Sultan, all the European rulers, unsuccessful and unlucky, having been defeated at the hands of Sultan Salahuddin, returned to Europe. In this way, the 5-year war of the European rulers with Sultan Salahuddin ended. Although the whole of Europe had risen in response to the appeal of the Christians, Great Pope, the kings of England and France, Germany's ruler, the Duke of Burgundy of France, besides hundreds of other nobles and large landowners from Europe, had come with their respective armies to face the Sultan. But the Sultan proved to be an iron wall before them. They could not move him an inch, and all had to return after suffering failure and disgraceful defeat. After the end of the war, many Christian rulers began to come to the Sultan's service and express obedience. Therefore, first, the ruler of Antioch came to the Sultan's service and expressed obedience before the Sultan. Besides him, various priests and great religious and military leaders also kept coming to the Sultan's service. They just wanted to see that Sultan of the Muslims, who had defeated them time and again and forced them to flee from Palestine. After being free from the war, the Sultan went to the city of Damascus. Then it happened that in the rainy season, the Sultan went out to receive the people returning from Hajj and got wet in the rain. As a result, he started having a fever, and along with that, he started having a severe headache. Doctors kept treating him, but he did not get relief. Day by day, the Sultan getting weaker. To run the government affairs, the Sultan had appointed his son. In his illness, the Sultan probably knew that he would die due to this illness, and would not recover from this illness. Therefore, he called his sons before him, and giving them the last advice, began to say, "My sons, I entrust you to Allah. Always obey His command, because therein lies safety. Refrain from bloodshed, and try your best to win the hearts of your subjects, and take care of their prosperity, because you have been appointed for Allah's side, and from my side for their comfort. No, try to win the hearts of your emirs, viziers and commanders. I won the people's hearts with kindness and affection, and therein lies the secret of my honor and greatness. In this way, this great conqueror of the world, this great son of the Islamic world, on March 4, 1193, departed forever from this mortal world. Indeed, we belong to Allah, and indeed to Him we will return, according to the Sultan's will and advice." Bricks for the grave were provided from the Sultan's personal income, and the shroud was prepared. It is said that in Damascus, when people saw the Sultan's funeral, people gathered in such numbers that such a large crowd had never been seen before. People were crying bitterly, remembering the Sultan, mourning the Sultan. The people who came in the funeral were wailing so badly that due to the wailing, it was difficult for them to utter the words of the prayer. Everyone's eyes were full. People were crying profusely, calling out the Sultan, remembering him. Then the Sultan was entrusted to the dust in the fortress of Damascus. Due to repeatedly defeating the people of Europe and reclaiming the Muslim areas that the Christians had ruled for 90 years, the Sultan had become extremely dear to his subjects. It is said that Sultan Salahuddin, who at the time of his death was the ruler and owner of the regions of Jazira Sham, Palestine, Egypt, and countless other fertile and populous areas when he died, only 1 dinar and 40 dirhams were found on him. Apart from this, he had no wealth, property, cash, or goods of any kind. This was because he would spend everything he received in the path of Allah, and lived his life relying on Allah. At the time when Sultan Salahuddin was breathing his last and his soul was about to depart from the world, A Qari was reciting the Holy Quran near him. When the Qari reached this verse, "I rely only on Allah," at that very moment the Sultan's soul departed from this mortal world. Sultan Salahuddin was a perfect example of an ideal life for Muslims. Sultan Salahuddin was a Muslim with a solid faith in the heart. Reading the conditions of his life refreshes the memory of the Muslims' great feats and their excellent character. Non-Muslim historians write that Sultan Salahuddin was a great ruler. Seeing his face, feelings of respect and love arose in people's hearts. Anyone could come and go to him freely. His thoughts were very refined and lofty. Whoever came to meet him, the Sultan would win him over like himself. The Sultan would listen to his visitors with great interest. If someone was in need, he would fulfill his need immediately. He would work with his army as an ordinary person and a soldier. He worked like a laborer in the construction of forts and city walls. It is said that during work, the Sultan not only supervised the work but also carried stones on his shoulders and never considered this work burdensome for himself. Sultan Salahuddin's ancestors were from a village called Diwan in Armenia, and this area was located in a mountainous region between Iran and the Asian Caucasus, where Kurds were populated in large numbers. It is said that Sultan Salahuddin's ancestors also belonged to the Kurds. The Kurds have been leading a rebellious and nomadic life since ancient times. These people, in their nomadic and tribal life, hospitality, bravery, and their honor and reputation and courage, resembled the Arabs. They have always been brave and warlike. In civilization and culture, they were considered inferior and incomparable to others, but they also had many qualities. It is said that their greatest quality was that among them was born such a commendable person, great sultan, and incomparable commander like Sultan Salahuddin. Sultan Saladin's grandfather, Shadi bin Marwan, was from that village of Diwan. He had inherited fame and honor, but then gradually decline set in upon him because due to having a large family, he became a victim of poverty. Therefore, Salahuddin Ayyubi's grandfather decided to leave his village, Diwan, and go to Baghdad. He had heard that from the Caliph's court, brave, courageous, and brave people get rewards and honors. Therefore, he also headed for Baghdad, because he was a very brave young man and courageous. It is said that in the bustling life of Baghdad, Saladin's grandfather also intended to seek livelihood for his sons. Sultan Salahuddin's grandfather had a Greek close friend named Bayraz, who was also from Diwan, but after coming to Iran, he had achieved a high position and was appointed as the Atabeg of the Seljuk prince. Upon reaching Baghdad, Sultan Salahuddin's grandfather sought the help of his old friend Bayraz. Therefore, Bayraz extended his cooperation and got his friend's son, i.e., Shadi Khan's son and Salahuddin's father, Ayyub, appointed as the governor of the fortress of Tikrit. In this way, Sultan Salahuddin's father reached Tikrit from Baghdad with his father Sham, brother Sherkoa, and other family members. Sultan Salahuddin's father Ayyub was also a very intelligent, brave, and slow-speaking person, while his brother and Sultan Salahuddin's uncle, Sherko, was somewhat quick, tempered and harsh by nature and temperament. One day, Sultan Salahuddin's uncle, Sherko, was passing through the wicked and rogue misbehave with a woman. He could not tolerate this bad character. He attacked that rogue and killed him. On this murder, Sultan Salahuddin's grandfather, Shadi bin Marwan's friend, Bayraz, became very angry because even before this, he was angry with Sultan Salahuddin's father due to another incident. That incident was somewhat like this. There was a Muslim commander, Imaduddin Zengi. He, escaping from some of his enemies, came towards the bank of the Tigris River, where the city of Tikrit was located, which was ruled by Sultan Salahuddin's father. Now Imaduddin's enemies were pursuing him. Imaduddin had only two paths: either cross the Tigris River or take refuge inside the formidable fortress of Tikrit on the bank of the Tigris River. This fortress was extremely strong and fortified, because on its defensive side, a deep trench was dug, to reach which some steps were cut into the rock that went to the base of the fortress. Now Salahuddin, who was an excellent Muslim commander, had only two ways to escape from the enemy: either cross the river or the governor of the fortress, i.e. Sultan Salahuddin's father, gives him refuge in the fortress. Sultan Salahuddin's father was very merciful. And then when he found out that the one fleeing was a great Muslim commander, and a very large enemy army was in pursuit of him, he provided Salahuddin with a fleet of boats with the help of which he crossed the river and reached a safe place. Salahuddin reached his entire life fighting against Christians and Crusaders, and he was the ruler of Mosul. Behrouz was also among the opponents of Salahuddin, therefore he became angry with Salahuddin's father. The first incident was that Salahuddin's father helped Salahuddin, which became the cause of Behrouz's anger. The second reason was when a person was killed by Sherko in the middle of the market. And when Behrouz received the news, then Behrouz issued the order that Sultan Salahuddin's father is removed from the governorship of Tikrit. Therefore he may leave Tikrit and go wherever he wishes. When Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi's father, Ayyub, was removed from the governorship of Tikrit, and the day he had to leave Tikrit, on the same night, a son was born to him, and this son was Salahuddin. When this son, Sultan Salahuddin, was born, people considered his birth a bad omen because the child was born at a time when his father was leaving Tikrit in a state of extreme helplessness and had been dismissed from the governorship. But historians write that a more wrong interpretation of an omen has never been understood, because if Salahuddin's birth at that time was a bad omen, then a child with better omens has never been born in the pages of history, who, when he grew up, created an impossible revolution within the world of Islam and the world. Anyway, Sultan Salahuddin's father left Tikrit and set out for Mosul. In Mosul, Salahuddin Zangi was the ruler. He was the same Salahuddin whom Sultan Salahuddin's father had provided boats at that time, and helped his army cross the Tigris River. When Salahuddin Zangi's enemies were in pursuit of him, when Sultan Salahuddin's father reached Mosul, and presented himself in the service of Salahuddin Zangi, Salahuddin Zangi was so happy to see him that it cannot be expressed in words. He had remembered the incident of crossing the river, had not forgotten it. Salahuddin kept Salahuddin's father Ayyub with him and made him the governor of an area where Salahuddin's father kept progressing with his capability. Then, under the patronage of the same Salahuddin Zangi's son, Nuruddin Zangi, Salahuddin himself progressed through the stages, and finally appeared before the world as a great son of the Islamic world, and the world's best conqueror. Sultan Salahuddin's conquering feats, and continuously defeating his enemies are not the only reason for his worldwide fame and greatness, but his humanity, nobility, high character, and magnanimity also make him a great person, and the noblest conqueror in the eyes of the world, worthy of eternal respect and honor, and make him immortal. Very few conquerors have passed through the world who held fast to the mantle of humanity and nobility during their conquests, especially in such wars that are fought on religious basis with extremely intense religious sentiments, in which often and mostly revenge flares up, from which the mantle of humanity is rarely saved. The two general and prolonged wars of the world, which are given the name of Crusades, were fought between the two great religions, i.e., Muslims and Christians, and these wars also present the best example of the character of both communities. When the Christians conquered Beit al-Muqaddas, then intoxicated with the joy of their victory and religious enthusiasm and zeal, they exhibited brutality. They committed such atrocities against innocent human beings like themselves that they stand in the description of Genghis Khan and Hulagu. They are called not conquerors but bloodthirsty beasts who came out of their mean streets and fell upon the world of the Eastern religion. Therefore, not only do Muslims look at such crusader invaders with hatred, but their own co-religionists also look at them with hatred. A Christian historian, Moore, writes that the Christian invaders were the meanest and most foolish beasts. Their behavior with those who participated in the war was bad, but their tyrannical treatment of the innocent subjects, besides women, children, and the elderly, was exactly the same. They massacred everyone indiscriminately. It was extreme ignorance and brutality, the like of which cannot be expected from any human being. Regarding that brutality of the Christians, Sheikh Saadi had said, "To call them human is an insult to humanity." Another French historian, Rigaud, writes that to preserve the honor and dignity of the Crusaders, it would have been better not to repeat this tale of bloodshed and terror, which not only mixed their honor with dust and blood, but also degraded them from humanity. Another Western historian, Paul, writes that this unjust shedding of Muslims' blood mixed the honor of the entire world with dust, and made this laid with blood stains, where once love and mercy were sought. There was this difference between Muslims and Crusaders, that when the Crusaders conquered Beit al-Muqaddas, they shed the blood of Muslims inside this city to their heart's content. But on the other hand, the character of the Muslims is completely different from them. First of all, Farrukh Azam conquered this city, and he treated the Christians excellently. No one was killed unnecessarily, no one was put to death, everyone was given general pardon. Similarly, when Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi also conquered Beit al-Muqaddas, he not only kept the Sunnah of Farrukhi alive, but also matched his treatment with the conquest of Mecca by the Holy Prophet, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, when he pardoned all the people. In this way, this great conqueror, Sultan Salahuddin, also presented the distinction and exemplary character of a Muslim conqueror to the world. This holy place, where countless prophets gave lessons of humanity to this world, where Jesus Christ, the peace be upon him, conveyed the message to the Israelites that blessed are those who are merciful. And at this very place the chief of the prophets, Muhammad's peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, was granted the ascension, the pinnacle of humanity. On this basis, Sultan Salahuddin conquered this city with great reverence and with the shadow of honor and respect. 90 years before Sultan Salahuddin, when the Crusader brothers in Christ conquered this city, they committed such atrocities whose example cannot be presented. They massacred the Muslims to such an extent that blood flowed up to the knees of the horses. But when the great Muslim conqueror, Sultan Salahuddin, conquered Beit al-Muqaddas, he did not allow a single drop of blood to be shed there. During the siege of this holy city, he repeatedly sent word to the enemy that, like you, I also consider Beit al-Muqaddas the house of Allah and dislike desecrating its sanctity with bloodshed. The conquest of Beit al-Muqaddas was a living proof of the generosity, magnanimity, humanity, and nobility of a great conqueror like Sultan Salahuddin. The successful defense of this city against the entire Christian world is also a very great feat of this greatness and courage. During the Third Crusade, the great emperors and crusader heroes of the Christian world, who had invaded the Muslims to conquer Beit al-Muqaddas, before whose advancing torrent of power and glory, Sultan Salahuddin appeared alone and weak. But according to the Western historian Paul, all the rulers of Europe clashed with Sultan Salahuddin, but could not move him an inch. The Sultan stopped the unceasing flood coming from Europe on the shore itself and did not let it advance. The Sultan had erected a long, solid wall from Acre to Jaffa with his army of a few thousand, in front of the army of hundreds of thousands, against which the European invaders bruised their heads and exhausted their powers. According to the Europeans, the hero of the Third Crusade was England's King Richard, who was commanding the entire European army at that time, whom the Europeans remember by the name of Lionheart. In the wars against Sultan Salahuddin, he had become so tired that he could not take a single step towards Jerusalem. Repeatedly, the Sultan defeated him in various places and tired him out. When he had left Europe, he had sworn that he would not return without conquering Beit al-Muqaddas. But this oath of his also went in vain, and his intention to conquer Beit al-Muqaddas also remained a troubled dream. In this way, Sultan Salahuddin not only conquered Beit al-Muqaddas and all those areas that the European invaders had previously captured and ruled for 90 years, but after 90 years, the Sultan struck them and took back his areas. And then no European ruler had the courage and daring to face Sultan Salahuddin in any battlefield or to crush him. I hope you liked this audiobook and you learned a lot from it. Please let me know your opinion. And if you haven't subscribed to our channel, Untold Stories by Zohaib yet, then subscribe and press the bell button next to it so that you can get the notification of every new video on time. Take care of yourself.